originally released in 1997, Final Fantasy VII later became the most successful role-playing game ever released in Western video gaming markets. With all of the attention that were focused upon it in terms of reactions on praise upon the original's release, even decades later when looking back upon it, there were still details that weren't exactly known as well as rumors about the game that persisted after its release. Before 1997, there were actually different claims of what the best role-playing game that had ever been created up until that time varied, depending if you were either a Japanese gamer or a Western gamer, or even your knowledge based on video games that were available to you. In Japan, during the mid to late 1990s, had Final Fantasy VI being released to positive critic and gamer reception within Japan. 7's plot and story were more refined details from 6 in specific instances, such as Terra being of mixed heritage and Aerith being of mixed heritage, a dystopian Midgard being essentially controlled by the Shinra Corporation in 7 was based off the Gestalt Empire from 6. The resistance group of Avalanche is similar to the Returners, which was also a rebel-based organization from 6 as well. The situation in terms of story with the world of balance within 6 and the live stream from 7. Even the introductional musical composition from 7 is based in part on the compositional piece from 6. Depending on the age of gamers at the time, in terms of all of these factors being considered, most would have had to agree that 6 was technically at that particular time the greatest role-playing game. The argument was that 7 was the first to have such international exposure in terms of recognition and in terms of achievements. Although well deserved, these comparisons between Final Fantasy VI to Final Fantasy VII can't be ignored. In terms of technology, details about the game, that is, it was originally supposed to have been released on the Nintendo 64 with the disk drive. But the now monumental schism between Nintendo and Sony caused the original PlayStation to be created during this split, and the game was released on it instead. An important factor with consideration to gamers placing their praise for 7 is that it was one of the first games to use or feature in-game cutscenes or cinematic depictions of the game instead of the usual read-to-text, which was the standard depiction between characters or events or circumstances before 7's release in terms of story explanation. It's also known that due to these circumstances and reasons, Final Fantasy VII helped to sell Sony PlayStation consoles, which helped to solidify Sony's reputation as the premier console producer. And from 7's release to the mid-2010s, Final Fantasy games were almost exclusive to Sony PlayStation consoles. Development of Final Fantasy VII also had it that the characters in the game had 2 limit breaks per level, but according to information now known, there were originally supposed to be 3 per level, but due to developmental time constraints, the amount of limit breaks were later restricted to just 2. The most popular theory was of course that Aerith was supposed to have been brought back from the dead. This is a confirmed fact. She was supposed to return through the story, but due to developmental circumstances, the death of Aerith remained permanent, and this permanent death was later fully incorporated into the story of Final Fantasy VII. An interesting theory from the time mentioned that the game was nearly completely from that of Cloud's point of view, and through the story how did that Cloud couldn't exactly be trusted, not in terms of details or even if what he were saying to others as well as even thinking to himself was the truth. Was he really that of a soldier first class? No. An experienced soldier? Yes, but nowhere near as what he thought of himself as sometimes with experience, due to the original game having somewhat vague details of particular situations. Some thought that Cloud was a clone of Sephiroth, and somehow got his own sense of self. Others thought that Cloud was an average fighter but was a traumatized young man through circumstances in his life and decided that he would be better off impersonating someone else instead. These details were reinforced with the fact that Tifa was Cloud's closest friend as a child, and she knew him, with the fact that this person was the same that she had known from her childhood. Was he? The theory goes further that Tifa knew someone Cloud could have learned of these details and made him his own. It could have been that the Cloud depicted in the story might not have been the boy that Tifa had known all those years ago. Details from the game hinted that Cloud's details in certain situations when being asked about it were intentionally left vague, and everything could have been that of a bizarre coincidence. He had flashbacks of his mother and his time in Niflheim, but there wasn't anything clear about it besides her desiring for him to have an older girlfriend to take care of him. Details hinted that from the original game, Jenova was an extraterrestrial creature that had come to the planet eons ago and thought it had the ability to replicate, assimilate, or destroy organic life forms depending on what purpose it might serve to Jenova. The creature also consumed natural resources if there were no organic matter within its vicinity to assimilate or consume. Through these means, Jenova could theoretically consume all energy that a planet had to offer. It was mentioned in the original game that Jenova, that's not the creature's real name, it was simply a title given to it. Even the definition of gender didn't really apply to the original depiction of Jenova. It was assumed to be female simply because of its anatomical appearance. The age of the creature was also hinted at to be that of millions of years old, and had systematically consumed countless planets through the eons it had traveled through space before reaching the planet that Final Fantasy VII took place in. Attempting to consume the planet in ancient times, the Cetra, or the Ancients, fought Jenova and actually defeated her, but due to their limited technology and understanding, couldn't necessarily kill the alien creature. Due in part to the situation at the time, Jenova's cells were spread across the planet into different organisms. So the main or original Jenova quote-unquote host went into a sort of hibernational status, until all of the living organisms infected by Jenova would return to where the original Jenova was located and help to heal or repair Jenova from the fight against the Cetra. That was what the Jenova reunion was all about. According to Sephiroth, the Cetra were the superior race of the planet. On their near extinction by Jenova, left the other creatures and races of the planet who were by his account inferior as the caretakers of the planet. Throughout the eons, the Cetra were mentioned as being near extinct, and Aerith was the last of the Cetra people despite her being of mixed descent and not a full-blooded Cetra. Sephiroth also thought little of Aerith due to her not being a full-blooded Cetra, and nothing more than an imitation of a Cetra. Sephiroth also thought of him to be that of a descendant of the Cetra, but through this story it's mentioned that he was confused and somewhat desired the prestige of the Cetra people. Sephiroth once called Cloud traitor, in the fact that Cloud, being a descendant of one of the peoples who fought alongside the Cetra in ancient times against Jenova, but didn't do enough to help prevent the extinction of the Ancients. Sephiroth was in fact a normal being, and his powers or abilities are in fact as mentioned that he was out of a half-clone, injected with Mako energy on Jenova's cells while he was in the womb of his mother, Lucervicia, against her wishes by his father, the Shinra scientist of Hojo. Sephiroth himself wasn't truly depicted in the game until the final cinematic battle against Cloud. All of the battles against him throughout the game were Jenova organisms assuming the visage of Sephiroth, also in part to initiate the Jenova reunion. Sephiroth had become so powerful that his mental will had actually gained control over Genova and its cells. His will to summon meteor to crack the planet open. Once this is to occur, the energy of the planet would automatically attempt to heal the wound, hence the life stream. Sephiroth desired to take control of the planet itself through absorption of the life stream, which was depicted and mentioned in the game as the essence or soul of the planet. Once he obtained the power of the planet, then he would use the empty shell of the planet as an empty vessel and control Genova as a weapon to use against any other world he were to come across and to travel through the cosmos, just as Genova did eons before. Sephiroth's ultimate ambition is to visit the Promised Land, a so-called land of boundless infinite Mako energy, where if he were to absorb all of it, he would become a literal god. But for what or where the Promised Land is, was never fully depicted nor mentioned in the game. Cloud based his whole illusion of a life on that of Zack's real life. Cloud was completely obsessed with Zack. From his haircut, which Cloud imitated, to his uniform, which Cloud imitated. Soldier First Class? No, that was Zack. The Buster Sword? That originally belonged to Zack. Zack was the soldier whom Cloud wished that he was. All of the respect, all of the praise, all of the adventure, all of the mystery was that of Zack. An extraordinarily important fact that is discreetly mentioned a few times in the original game were that both Tifa and Aerith were possibly romantically involved with Zack in terms of a relationship. An optional cinematic can be seen in the basement of the mansion within Niflheim that pertained to both Cloud and Zack. It explained the entire situation between Zack and Cloud, where Zack died, and Cloud, whom was already traumatized from experiences in his own life, mentally broke down and essentially became Zack from that time onwards. This was why Tifa was speechless when Cloud commented on past times in his life, because she knew that he was lying, but couldn't or wouldn't say anything at that particular point in the game, due to fears of what might happen. Would Cloud have a nervous breakdown when confronted with the truth? Would he become aggressive towards her? She didn't know, and that's why she didn't say anything at that particular time of the game. Later on, she did, due to the fact that most of the circumstances between Zack and Cloud were made public knowledge, and Cloud couldn't necessarily lie about that anymore. After 7's original release, Square received critical acclaim internationally for the depth of the game's story, portrayal for its characters, and originality for the premise of the game. The ending of 7 wasn't exactly clear as to if the characters had survived the final battle. The final scene of the game showed Midgar in ruins an amount of time later, and only Red 13 was depicted showing his own cubs the former city. That was it, nothing else. But nothing else were needed in terms of details for the story nor explanation. Square knew how popular the game was at the time, and decided to leave it as that and continue with future projects that later became other Final Fantasy games. But eventually, Square as a company, with its video game production, wasn't like what it once was. It became something of a nostalgia experience to return to the Final Fantasy VII universe by adding to it and redoing it for further financial gain. The situation didn't get much better for Square, as prior to the remake's release, public opinion of Square wasn't exactly favorable, and gamers often commented online when asked that the company wasn't as groundbreaking as it once was in terms of games, and what it produced in modern times in terms of video gaming experiences was still brilliant, but not the game-changing and revolutionary in terms of quality or originality that it once was. While the remake was a highly enjoyable game, some of the older fans still mention that the original Final Fantasy VII was a better gaming experience.